The protagonist of this story, Ghislain Perdium, has a reputation for being an uncontrollable sword master, a man stuck in his room and out of his mind, and to top it off, the useless oldest son of Count Perdium. With all these glorified titles, you might think he's just some spoiled brat, but no, that's not the case. At least, not anymore. And his opponent is finding that out the hard way. This bearded bastard can barely believe his eyes as he's getting his ass handed to him by this so-called useless son of a gun. The protagonist, on the other hand, is as cool as a cucumber during the battle. He's actually pretty glad that all the money he spent setting this trap is finally paying off. So, he asks this bearded bastard if he's enjoying the surprise. This infuriates the bearded bastard because it feels like the protagonist knew exactly what was going to happen. The protagonist doesn't hesitate to own up to it. It's not just that he knew his enemy's plans, he knew everything from the start. He knew how many soldiers there were, who the spies were, and who helped this guy with reinforcements. He literally knew everything. The bearded bastard can hardly believe it. He starts shouting in disbelief, furious that his ace card has also been exposed by someone he thought was useless trash. But the protagonist isn't having any of it. He shuts the guy up with a solid kick to the face, making it clear that this yapping fool can talk all he wants. But no matter how many battles take place, the protagonist is certain that he will win. You might be wondering how he is so sure of victory every time. Well, it's because the protagonist literally knows everything. Now let's rewind a bit. Almost a year ago in the kingdom of Lithuania, near the Pyram estate, the protagonist wakes up to a shock. He's alive, but he shouldn't be. He was supposed to be dead. The last thing the protagonist remembers is being in the middle of a losing battle, facing off against one of the continent's top 7 noble knights, a man named Aduin, who was supposed to be the one to take him down. The protagonist, on the other hand, he held the title of one of the continent's top 7 mercenary kings, known far and wide as Ghislain Perdium. Before ending the protagonist's life, Aduin remarks how he did not expect to encounter the trash of the fallen Pyram household. As far as Aduin knows, the protagonist had left the family after his sister's death, so it seemed like his name had faded from memory. The protagonist is surprised to hear this and asks this bastard how he knows so much about him and his past. Aduin claims that he's known for a long time and had worked tirelessly to track the protagonist down because he was one of them, someone who had worked alongside the Deline household to bring the Pyram family to its knees. The mention of one of them catches the protagonist off guard because this means it wasn't just the Deline household behind the downfall of his family. There were others involved, and now, one of them was standing right in front of him. At that moment, the protagonist's disdain and thirst for revenge skyrocketed, and right then, Aduin cut his head clean off. But when the protagonist wakes up, he finds himself in one piece, even though his head was decapitated. Not only does he not have a single scratch on his body, but he also looks quite young. He starts looking around, unsure of what's going on. At that moment, someone calls out to him, addressing him as young master and telling him to come out. This man is Ricardo, a Pyram soldier, but the poor guy finds a sharp sword pointed at his neck while the protagonist demands he quickly answer his questions. Of course, the soldier on duty has no idea what's going on, so he just agrees to answer anything his master asks of him, though he wonders why his master has to point a sword just to ask a few questions. The protagonist is also quite surprised by this, as he wasn't expecting this kind of reaction from someone he considers an enemy. Ricardo quickly pulls away from his master's grasp, reminding him that he tired himself out from his tantrum earlier and fell asleep. Apparently, the protagonist had been stressed out about how to command the group to raid the orcs. As you can imagine, this doesn't make any sense to the protagonist. The soldier tells him to grab his stuff and get out because people are waiting for him outside. The protagonist has no clue where they're going, to which Ricardo reveals they're heading to the Pyram estate. The mention of his family name completely baffles him because, as far as he remembers, the Pyram estate had fallen. As they reach the place, the protagonist takes a bird's eye view from the hill, which clears up any lingering doubts. It's definitely the Pyram estate, even though he had already seen it reduced to ashes back then. Ricardo, under his breath, tries to inquire why his master keeps calling his own house a fallen one, warning that he might get kicked out if the Count hears it. Like any sane person, the protagonist pinches his cheek to see if he's dreaming, but the pain is real, so he guesses he's not. He reflects on how he now has a younger face, and his estate is in good shape. If he pieces it all together, this only means he's traveled back to the past. You see, his younger self resented the household. The immaturity born from feeling inferior led to trouble. Over time, more people in the household started to avoid him, and he couldn't withstand the criticism, so he ran away from home. But several years later, he became a mercenary. He survived countless battles, built up his skills, and made a name for himself. When he returned to Pyram to make up for his past mistakes, his household had already been reduced to dust. Now, he's gotten another shot at life. All the people he held dear are still here. He can barely contain his excitement, but it's too early to rejoice. From what he's learned from Ricardo, they're heading to raid the orcs. He vividly remembers this day. It was the day most of the people in his raid squad would die. In his past life, he had followed the raid squad to make a name for himself. At that time, the report said there were only 3 orcs, so the protagonist had thought it would be easy enough for someone like him, who had no experience commanding a squad. But when he got there were more than 20 orcs. Almost everyone ended up dying because of his foolishness and stubbornness. Right now, the protagonist is confident it should be doable since those orcs don't really have a strategy. But the problem is whether his soldiers will trust him, considering they all think he's some useless bastard. It looks like he doesn't have any time to prepare because a watchtower is obliterated as a horde of orcs comes charging in. The orcs are literally demolishing the soldiers left and right. Each orc is strong enough to take down multiple foot soldiers on its own without much effort. The raid squad commander, Skoven, jumps into the scene and tells everyone to get into a defensive formation, but it doesn't seem like any formation or strategy would work against these brute monsters. Even Skoven is sure they're screwed because, seriously, getting ambushed when they weren't prepared at all is brutal. Not only that, but there are way more of these monsters than expected. Suddenly, someone calls out to the commander. When he turns around, he notices a massive monster about to crush him with its axe. That's when the protagonist launches himself forward, yanks the commander away, and brutally cuts through the monster's hand like it's nothing more than a cucumber. Everyone is absolutely jaw-dropped to see how effortlessly the protagonist pulled off that move. After all, he's supposed to be trash. The monster finally falls, while the protagonist feels annoyed that his body still can't use mana. He then walks back to the commander, extends his hand, and demands the command. The commander didn't think someone as inexperienced as the protagonist should be leading soldiers in such a dangerous situation. Skoven flatly refused to hand over authority, reminding the protagonist that commanding isn't a game. The protagonist had already guessed no one would trust him, but it still pissed him off. When a monster charged at them, Skoven stepped in, calling the protagonist an idiot for trying to take the lead. Fed up, the protagonist decided it was time to prove himself. With a flick of his wrist, he sent his sword flying at the monster. The commander started berating him for insubordination but froze when he saw the orc drop dead from a single blow. The protagonist turned to Skoven, questioning if the commander even knew the most important thing in battle. Unsurprisingly, Skoven didn't. The protagonist shifted his attention to the terrified soldiers, telling them there's no way to win when fear is holding them back. To make his point, he charged forward, grabbed his sword from the dead orc, and leapt onto another one, driving the blade through its skull. Skoven and the soldiers could only watch in disbelief as the protagonist taunted the monsters, daring them to attack him. The orcs took the bait, charging straight at him. Moving with incredible speed and precision, the protagonist cut them down one by one, striking their weak spots with ease. Even as his stamina waned, he dodged attacks with minimal effort, fighting like a master swordsman. The soldiers called out to Skoven for orders, but he was too stunned to respond. All he could do was watch as the protagonist lured the remaining orcs toward the edge of a cliff. It wasn't until he noticed the protagonist's plan that Skoven finally acted, ordering the troops to form a shield wall. The protagonist reached the cliff's edge, and as the orcs closed in, he leapt off, signaling the soldiers to charge. With a united push, they sent the orcs tumbling to their deaths. When the dust settled, the soldiers were exhausted, but the protagonist was still clinging to the cliffside, his sword lodged into the rock. Despite the danger, he smirked at Skoven. The commander, shocked but impressed, extended his hand to help, but it was too short. The protagonist's grip slipped, and he fell. As he descended, he drifted into unconsciousness, hearing his sister's voice and reliving fragmented memories of her. Just as he thought he was lost, her hand grabbed his and pulled him back. He woke up in bed, his body aching all over. A maid entered, relieved to see him awake. It didn't take him long to recognize her as Belinda, his childhood maid who disappeared when his family fell to ruin. Overwhelmed, he hugged her tightly. When the protagonist decides to tell Belinda the truth, he drops some serious truth bombs. He warns her that a catastrophe will soon strike Piram and admits that he died and came back to life. Unsurprisingly, Belinda doesn't take him seriously. While she agrees the orcs nearly killed him, she dismisses his wild story as nonsense. He tries to explain again, but Belinda cuts him off, scolding him for his reckless behavior. Frustrated, he gives up, realizing she won't believe him. Instead, she changes the subject and reminds him about the upcoming festival, something he might have missed if he'd been seriously injured. The mention of the festival catches him off guard. Seeing his confused expression, Belinda teases him, reminding him that Lady Elena has been waiting for for this day. She suggests it would be the perfect chance for the two siblings to reconnect. Finally, the protagonist remembers the festival. It happens around this time every year, but in his past life he never had the chance to enjoy it because of the trauma he endured. He asks how much time is left until it begins. Belinda tells him it's next week, giving him 7 days to prepare. But this festival isn't just a random memory for him. It marks the day a tragedy happened, one that haunted him for the rest of his life. On this day in his past life, his sister Elena died. As if summoned by his thoughts, Elena enters the room. As soon as the protagonist sees his sister, he rushes to hug her tightly. Elena is shocked by his sudden affection, blushing as she asks, "What are you doing? Is this some kind of prank?" Little does she know, his feelings are genuine. However, when he refuses to let go, she yanks herself free, leaving him staggering from her unexpected strength. It's clear the two siblings don't have the best relationship. Elena quickly points out that she's only visiting because Belinda invited her. She also reminds him of the time he insulted her, though the protagonist can't remember at first. But then it hits him. He wasn't a great brother in his past life. Swallowing his pride, he apologizes. Elena and Belinda are stunned. The protagonist never apologizes. They wonder if he got hit on the head during the orc attack. He shuts that down, insisting he's fine. Just as he's explaining, a sharp pain doubles him over. Elena wastes no time teasing him, but instead of feeling hurt, the protagonist is warmed by her words. She hasn't changed at all, he thinks, smiling. The memory of his past life weighs heavily on him. The last time he saw Elena, she'd invited him to a festival, but he turned her down. Shortly after, her body was found in the slums, torn apart along with her guards. Even now, he regrets not being there to protect her. A knock interrupts his thoughts. Her bodyguards, Jamal and Philip, enter. Elena scolds them for barging in, but they explain that the servants need her to oversee festival preparations. The protagonist is confused. Why would she be doing that? Belinda sighs, explaining that Scovin is short on workers, so even Elena has to pitch in. Wanting to help, the protagonist offers his assistance. Elena and Belinda are shocked, whispering again about possible head trauma. Later, at the bustling festival area, the protagonist insists on helping. Workers give him worry looks, and Elena tries to push him away, telling him he'll just get in the way. But he refuses to leave her alone. He knows what happened to her last time. Her body was found near the slums, far from the festival grounds. Someone either lured her there or forced her. He's determined to stop it from happening again. Just then, Fergus, an older knight, rushes over. Out of breath and teary-eyed, Fergus says he's relieved the protagonist survived the orc attack. Elena adds that her brother has been acting strangely, suggesting Fergus take him back to rest. Reluctantly, the protagonist agrees but asks Fergus to take him to the abandoned training hall instead. When they arrive, the protagonist is surprised to see the training hall in great condition. Fergus explains that it was maintained in case he ever wanted to use it. Moved by Fergus's dedication, the protagonist pats him on the shoulder and jokes, "Dying was awful. I plan to live a long life this time." Fergus, confused, dismisses it as nonsense. Left alone, the protagonist begins training. He recalls rumors from his past life. A neighboring lord orchestrated Elena's death, triggering a war that destroyed Scovin. Her death was the start of his family's downfall. Determined to change the future, he pushes himself to master mana control. Using a technique to create multiple mana cores, he weaves them into an explosive mesh. The strain causes blood to drip from his nose and mouth, but he doesn't stop. Though the technique is unstable, it's a step forward. It reminds him of his defeat by Eden in his past life. He'd run out of mana at the worst time. This time, he vows it will be different. A week later, the festival begins. The protagonist walks through town confidently, surprising Elena. She teases him, shocked that her brother, who hated festivals, actually showed up. She also notes his recent dedication to training. He shrugs, claiming it's normal for the heir of a knightly family. Despite her teasing, she seems happy to see him changing. As the day unfolds, the protagonist stays close to Elena, refusing to leave her side. Her bodyguards suggest taking her to a livelier area of the festival. Watching them escort her away, the protagonist's mind races. It hits him. These guards are the traitors. They're the ones who betrayed my family and led Elena to her death. Elena's escort knights, Jamal and Philip, were the most trusted members of the family. They had been protecting Elena since she was a child, and it was believed they were murdered while defending her in the protagonist's past life. However, in this life, the protagonist has lingering doubts. He suspects it must have been a trap and grows certain that these knights are the true traitors to the family. Determined to uncover the truth, he decides to follow them. The place they lead Elena to is eerily empty, leaving her visibly visibly annoyed as she starts to complain. While she vents her frustration, the protagonist's suspicions grow stronger. The street may seem like a simple, deserted one at first glance, but the strategic placement of obstacles blocking potential escape routes reveals that the location was prepared in advance. His thoughts are interrupted when Elena grabs his arm and begins dragging him along. Surprised by her sudden strength, the protagonist jokingly asks if she has been working out, as her grip feels far too strong for a young lady. Their banter is cut short when Jamal stops them, and the ominous look on his face sends a chill through the air. Elena starts to shiver and panic, confused by their strange behavior. Jamal quickly apologizes for the unsettling expression, but then smirks menacingly. His twisted grin only worsens Elena's fear as he tells her he just needs her to wait a little longer. It's only a small request, after all. At that moment, someone enters the scene. A man wearing glasses, followed closely by two goons, steps forward. The man, named Frank, surveys the situation with satisfaction, commending Jamal on a well-executed plan. However, Frank's expression sours when he notices the protagonist. "I don't recall asking you to bring this sucker," he sneers. Jamal reassures his boss, promising to take care of the protagonist for free, claiming the boy followed his sister without realizing he was walking into his own grave. Finally, the protagonist speaks, his voice calm but laced with venom. He questions Frank, asking how he plans to escape after betraying the Paradigm family. Frank snickers arrogantly, showing no fear. He boasts that all he has to do is run far away, as he's tired of this poverty-stricken land torn apart by barbarians. He claims many others share his desire to leave Scoven. Before he can finish, the protagonist cuts him off, not with words, but with his blade. Blood sprays as Frank's body collapses to the ground, split cleanly in two. Everyone is stunned. The protagonist, furious, reminds the fallen traitor that while some may leave, they never betray their homeland. His piercing glare turns to Jamal, who grabs Elena in desperation, hoping to use her as a shield. His attempt is futile. The protagonist's sword pierces his skull, ending his life in seconds. The remaining lackeys hesitate, fear and doubt clouding their judgment. They had heard rumors that the eldest son of the Paradigm family lacked combat experience, yet here he was, dispatching seasoned fighters with terrifying ease. Frank, however, remains composed. His shock is evident, but he quickly regains his composure. "Impressive," he admits. "So, the rumors were wrong. You're not just a useless heir. But where did you learn to fight like that?" The protagonist ignores the question, shutting Frank down with a sharp retort. "That's none of your business." He sizes up the remaining enemies, 3 in total, but only Frank exudes any significant mana. The protagonist demands to know who hired them for this ambush, but Frank dismisses the question with a smug grin. "Someone about to die shouldn't care about such things," he replies. Realizing they won't talk, the protagonist prepares to end the confrontation. One of the lackeys suggests cutting off the protagonist's head, but Frank intervenes. "I want him alive," he commands, his voice dripping with malice. "I'll break every bone in his body and leave him writhing in agony." With that, the lackeys charge. Anticipating their move, the protagonist pulls out a firecracker and tosses it. The unexpected ploy startles one of the attackers, creating a brief moment of hesitation. The protagonist capitalizes on the opening, striking with precision and killing the man instantly. The second lackey rushes in, but the protagonist disarms him effortlessly and follows up with a lethal blow, cutting him down. Frank, seeing his men fall, attempts a cowardly sneak attack. The protagonist's heightened reflexes kick in, and he blocks the strike with ease. Frank, stunned, retreats momentarily, realizing his near-perfect ambush has failed. Without hesitation, the protagonist retaliates, moving so quickly that Frank barely has time to react. The blade slices deep across Frank's throat, and the pipe he had been holding clatters to the ground. Frank stumbles back, struggling to regain composure. "You should have died already," he snarls. Frank had always prided himself on his strength, but now, gripping his sword tightly, he charged at the protagonist. For a moment, he thought he had the upper hand, but then, he saw the grin. It wasn't one of desperation. It was a grin of confidence, one that threw Frank completely off balance. It was almost as if the protagonist wanted this fight. With one swift move, the protagonist overpowered him, landing a solid kick straight to Frank's face. Yet, Frank managed to land on his feet, smirking as he wiped the blood off his mouth. "Nice try," he sneered. "But with my mana levels, that kind of move won't work." He was proven dead wrong. Suddenly, he started coughing, blood pouring from his mouth, his face twisted in confusion. How, even with thick mana reinforcing his body, how had the protagonist managed to pierce through it? Frank stumbled, trying to process what had just happened. The protagonist stood there, eyes cold as ice. Memories of his sister's death flashed through his mind. For years, he had lived with the mystery, not knowing who was behind it. But now he knew, and now Frank would pay. pay. Prepare yourself, the protagonist growled. His voice was steady, unshaken. With that, he activated his third core. Frank's eyes widened in disbelief. Before he could react, the protagonist was already in his face. Their blades clashed with such intensity that sparks flew, the air around them vibrating with raw energy. Frank fought with everything he had, but it was clear he couldn't keep up. His hands were going numb, his mana reserves draining faster than he could replenish them. His sword, once unbreakable, began to crack under the pressure. What kind of technique is this? Frank thought, panic creeping into his mind. He had never encountered anything like it. Protagonist's movements were precise, each strike more devastating than the last. It was as if he had become an entirely different person. Before Frank could comprehend, the protagonist landed a brutal slash across his torso, leaving a deep, bleeding wound. But the protagonist wasn't finished. Driving his blade into Frank's abdomen, he ensured his opponent wouldn't die immediately. There were questions that needed answering. Who ordered Elena's assassination? The protagonist demanded, his voice dripping with venom. Frank's face contorted in pain, but he wasn't ready to talk. Instead, he reached for hidden daggers. But before he could act, something stopped him. Thin, shimmering threads wrapped around his arms, immobilizing him. Frank stared in shock. The threads weren't ordinary. They were made of mana. The protagonist tightened the threads, his patience wearing thin. You get one last chance, he warned. Talk, or I'll destroy your mana core. Frank's disbelief grew as he realized the protagonist wasn't bluffing. The sword lodged in his stomach began to glow as the protagonist poured magic energy into it. The pain was excruciating, and Frank screamed as he felt his mana core fracturing. It was a dangerous move. One misstep, and the backflow of mana could cause a catastrophic explosion. But the protagonist wasn't an amateur. He controlled the flow with terrifying precision. Finally, Frank broke. Count Desmond, he spat, desperation in his voice. He's the one who ordered the hit. It was all a setup to start a war between the Pyram and Scoven families. The protagonist's eyes narrowed. The name Desmond struck a chord. In his previous life, such underground dealings were often orchestrated by families allied with the ducal houses. If his instincts were right, Duke Deline was pulling the strings. But the fact remained, Frank had been the one to take Elena's life. The protagonist wasn't about to let him go. As he prepared to deliver the final blow, Frank sneered through the pain. Killing me won't change anything, he taunted. The Scoven family's plans are already in motion. Pyram will perish in the war. The protagonist silenced him with a hand over his mouth. Leaning in, he whispered, I've reawakened from death. This time, I'll rewrite the future. With those words, he shattered Frank's mana core completely. The backflow of energy surged, and the protagonist directed it skyward. The resulting explosion lit up the night like a twisted firework, a grim testament to Frank's end. Exhausted but alive, the protagonist turned to his unconscious sister. Elena was safe, but his body protested. Blood dripped from his mouth, the strain of using 3 cores taking its toll. He reflected bitterly. In his past life as the Mercenary King, such feats had been easy, but this weaker body was a constant reminder of his limitations. Still, he pushed forward. Carrying Elena, he found a nearby home. Inside lay a corpse, the son of the Scoven family and an escort knight. In his previous life, these bodies had been used as evidence to pin Elena's assassination on the Scoven family, sparking a war. Determined to prevent history from repeating, the protagonist destroyed all traces. He torched the house, ensuring no one could manipulate the narrative. As the flames consumed the evidence, the protagonist carried Elena away. But from the shadows, a mysterious figure was watching. The hooded man arrives at the council, a group of shadowy figures pulling the strings from behind the scenes. He delivers his grim report. The mission has failed. The room crackles with tension as the big shots react, their displeasure obvious. Failed? One of them growls, eyes narrowing dangerously. And why exactly? The hooded man quickly places the blame on a single name, Ghislain Perdium. The council collectively pauses. A skeptical voice scoffs. Ghislain Perdium? That useless bastard from the north? How could he possibly pull off something like this? The hooded man insists, his voice strained. Ghislain was completely different from the intel we had. He handled everything, with finesse, with precision, as though he were a completely different person. The council members exchange uneasy glances. Their intel had failed them, and they know it. Trying to recover, the hooded man adds, but I've already dealt with the guard. Starting the territorial war won't be an issue. Desperation leaks into his tone as he begs. Just one more chance. I'll prove myself. One of the big shots explodes with frustration. You expect us to trust you again? The entire council is losing their minds over this mess. That bastard Ghislain needs to be eliminated immediately. The biggest of the big shots finally speaks, cutting through the tension. His voice is low and commanding. How do you plan to deal with that kid? The hooded man straightens, prepared for this question. I'll make the duel happen naturally. The opponent will be Kane Lowes. The council reacts with surprise. Kane Lowes? Yes, the hooded man confirms. A renowned swordsman. His strength-based swordsmanship is unmatched in the north, even at his young age. And as Gislin's cousin, it won't look forced for them to meet in combat. Silence falls over the council as they weigh the plan. Finally, the leader speaks again, his voice cold. Fine, but understand this. If you fail again, there will be no next time. The scene shifts to Perdium Castle's training hall. Fergus arrives to announce mealtime but halts, startled as a thin thread of mana shoots toward him. The thread snatches the sword hanging beside him and retracts with lightning speed back toward its caster. The protagonist stands at the center of the hall, holding the sword with satisfaction. Mana threads? I used them all the time in my previous life, but right now, my mana core isn't strong enough. For now, I'm sticking to just one thread to conserve mana. Fergus stares in awe. I've never seen anything like that. You didn't even use mana until recently. How did you come up with such a novel technique? The protagonist shrugs, brushing it off. It's nothing special. Fergus bows humbly. Still, I wanted to thank you for protecting the young lady. The protagonist's tone is flat, dismissive. She's my sister. It's only natural. A few days later, the festival remains paused. Rumors swirl after the shocking revelation that a guardian knight tried to traffic the young lady. In her chambers, Elena paces angrily. No one even believes you were the one who saved me, she fumes. The protagonist merely shrugs. They wouldn't believe me either. Belinda seethes nearby. Jamal and Philly, those traitors. They dared to harm Elena. The protagonist listens quietly, relieved that his sister survived and that he managed to prevent a war. But he knows their enemies won't give up so easily. He needs to strengthen their forces. Just then, a maid enters, carrying a meal. To the protagonist's surprise, she places a dry piece of bread on the table. What's this? He asks, turning to Belinda. She sighs. A consequence of recent events. Funds are tighter than ever. A sudden commotion outside draws their attention. Merchants have gathered in an angry mob, demanding compensation for the festival's cancellation. The economy relies on merchant profits from the festival, Belinda reminds him. Without them, we're collapsing. The protagonist orders Fergus. Send soldiers to calm the crowd. Fergus grimaces. We can't. All of our soldiers have been sent to the forest for reconstruction after the orc raid. The full weight of Perdium's dire state settles on the protagonist. Constant war with northern barbarians, frequent monster attacks, and now economic chaos have drained their resources completely. He turns to Belinda. What about the treasury? She shakes her head. Your allowance was cut off after your extravagant spending. The protagonist grits his teeth. No soldiers, no funds, no resources. His situation is worse than he realized. Suddenly, Ricardo bursts into the room, breathless and frantic. What is it? The protagonist demands. Young Master Kane wishes to see you. The name sends a jolt through the protagonist. He rises immediately. The scene shifts to the castle courtyard, bruised and battered, clearly no match for Kane's raw strength. Kane flexes his immense muscles, his terrifying smile widening as he notices the protagonist's arrival. The two lock eyes. Anger burns within the protagonist as the tension between them thickens like a storm cloud. Along with this jacked-up guy, there's also his escort knight, the heir of Lowes County, with whom House Pyram had an alliance, is Kane Lowes. At the time, Kane was both the protagonist's only friend and his greatest enemy. The big guy stomps toward the protagonist after beating up his knight, but the protagonist doesn't flinch. He calmly asks Ricardo what exactly led to this situation. Ricardo quickly explains that they had responded to a report of a disturbance at a tavern. When they arrived, they found Kane and his escort knight. It was there that Kane asked Commander Scovin if the rumors about young Master Gislin Paradum were true. Commander Scovin tried to explain the rumors, but Kane grabbed him by the mouth mid-sentence. Kane believed the commander was lying and refused to tolerate such disrespect in front of the heir of Lowes. At that moment, Kane's escort knight speaks up, claiming Ricardo isn't telling the full truth. He insists on explaining what really happened. According to him, Commander Scovin claimed that Gislin, who never even trains, took down an orc with his bare hands and defeated traitorous escort knights all by himself. The knight says that's why Scovin got beaten up for spreading such ridiculous lies. Smugly, the knight adds that none of this would have happened if Scovin had kept his mouth shut. The protagonist doesn't respond aloud, but in his thoughts, we see how much he despises Kane. Once upon a time, Kane was his subordinate, but whenever he visited Pyram, he always caused chaos. Despite the trouble, no one dared criticize him because of his status as an ally to House Pyram. Unlike Kane, the protagonist was always criticized and looked down upon. Switching to Kane's perspective, the arrogant bastard can't believe how patient the protagonist is being. Normally, he'd have exploded with anger after such provocation. We flash back to Lowes County, where Kane received a chilling order: kill the protagonist. The order came from a hooded man, a figure already facing backlash backlash for failing a previous mission. Desperate to redeem himself, the hooded man promised Cain that, if he succeeded, the esteemed one would fully support the Lowe's family. Cain agreed, confident that eliminating the weak brat would be easy. However, what nagged at him was the political complication of killing another heir. To solve this, the hooded man suggested they provoke the protagonist into a duel. A tragic accident between heirs would look far less suspicious. He even promised to disguise himself as an escort knight to help set the stage. Back in the present, Cain wonders what changed. Why is someone like Ghislain suddenly being targeted? Maybe he's become more dangerous. Whatever the reason, Cain decides to move forward with the plan. He smirks and calls out to the protagonist, taunting him for just standing there. Since the festival has been interrupted, Cain suggests they liven things up. The protagonist has no idea what Cain is getting at. Cain reminds him of their usual arrangements, a snide reference to the alcohol and women the protagonist was always forced to provide. Back then, the protagonist went along with it to avoid being beaten up, but this time is different. He has no intention of complying. Because of Cain's demands, the protagonist wasted enormous amounts of money, leading to his father cutting off his allowance. Now, he's realized the root cause of his financial troubles, and also the solution. Cain grows impatient and demands the goods immediately. Instead of cowering, the protagonist plays along, promising to bring them, but only if Cain repays his debts. The shift in the protagonist's demeanor makes the hooded man uneasy, and Cain himself looks serious. He demands to know what debts the protagonist is talking about. With a pleasant smile, the protagonist calmly reminds Cain of all the times he arranged alcohol, women, and festivities, all paid for out of his own pocket. Now, he wants that money back, at least 1,000 gold. Cain is stunned. He insists it couldn't have cost more than 100 gold. Besides, he thought the protagonist had done all of it willingly, as a favor between friends, but the protagonist doesn't see it that way. He's tired of being Cain's doormat and demands payment, warning Cain to pay up if he values his life. The room falls silent. Even Ricardo, the protagonist's knight, is sweating bullets at the boldness of the statement. Cain, furious, rises to his feet. He believes the rumors of the protagonist's deeds have gone to his head. To Cain, the protagonist is still a useless parasite. Cain throws a punch, ready to crush the leech, but the protagonist doesn't flinch. Just before the punch connects, he tilts his body slightly, letting it slide harmlessly past him. The room freezes. Cain, enraged, swings again, but the protagonist ducks and retaliates. He delivers a sharp, open-handed strike to Cain's gut. The force of the blow nearly knocks the wind out of him. Though Cain acts like he's in pain, there's no visible damage. The hooded man rushes over, but it's clear Cain's pride, far bigger than his muscles, has taken the real hit. The protagonist shrugs and tells Cain to quit whining. It was just a tap. Cain turns to the hooded knight and asks if his acting was convincing. The hooded man smirks and praises the performance, knowing Cain has set the stage perfectly. By feigning an attack, he's made the protagonist look like the aggressor. Now, the duel can be justified. With a smug grin, Cain pulls out his glove, preparing to challenge the protagonist to a duel. But before he can throw it, the protagonist beats him to it. With perfect timing, he tosses his own glove at Cain's face and declares a challenge. He demands justice for Cain's insults and for assaulting his knight. Once again, silence fills the room. Cain's smirk returns. He thinks the protagonist has sealed his own fate. Confidently, he accepts the duel. The protagonist calls out to Ricardo. He instructs him to summon all the merchants protesting outside the castle. The protagonist wants them to witness what happens next and make a fortune while they're at it. The young master of House Pyram is about to give them a show worth every coin. The festival was suddenly cancelled, and the atmosphere, which had reached its peak, abruptly cooled down. This left behind a crowd of tourists who couldn't help but feel regretful. They were likely in a state of incomplete combustion, unable to spend their money or time. If an event were to occur to soothe them, everyone would be over the moon. And so, as the protagonist stands in the ring against that bastard, the crowd goes absolutely bonkers with cheers. People are gathering from far-off places, and the merchants in the market are finally able to cash in on the lingering tourists. The fat merchant who was at the front of the line during the protests has set up a table where people can bet on their respective players. Unsurprisingly, many put their money on Master Cain, considering it the safest bet. The big bastard stands ready with his giant sword, looking visibly annoyed that the protagonist has turned a serious duel into a bustling marketplace. Before the duel begins, he makes one thing clear: his sword will not stop, even if the protagonist surrenders. The protagonist isn't terrified or surprised to hear this. He can already tell the bastard's intent is to kill, regardless. Once Once enough people have gathered, the protagonist officially declares the duel underway. However, that's when a hooded figure suddenly butts in, stating that the proper betting process can't proceed under the current circumstances. Everyone is confused about what this hooded guy means, so the fat merchant explains that nobody has bet on young master the protagonist. The crowd begins murmuring among themselves, believing the outcome to be obvious. The protagonist doesn't stand a chance. The hooded figure seems amused, remarking that even the marketplace doesn't want to be associated with the protagonist. Since the bets aren't balanced, they decide to change the criteria to make things fairer. That's when Commander Scoven steps forward, bringing out a bag full of cash and betting on young master the protagonist. Not only that, Lady Elena also arrives with a bag of money to bet on her brother. Everyone expected Commander Scoven to show up, but seeing Elena herself leaves even the protagonist slightly bewildered. The crowd too is stunned. Elena confidently asks the fat merchant if the money is sufficient, and he humbly confirms that it is. Now that people are betting on the protagonist, Kane decides to start the duel without wasting any more time, though he looks visibly irritated by the sudden turn of events. The duel begins, and the protagonist gives Kane the first chance to strike. After all, Kane is younger, and as a big brother, the protagonist generously lets his little brother go first. This cheap copy of the Hulk looks bewildered by the offer, but without wasting any time, he swings his massive sword as soon as it's unsheathed, charging at the protagonist like a bull. Their swords collide with a thunderous clang, and Kane pours every ounce of his strength into the attack, but nothing happens to the protagonist. Frustrated, another futile attempt, as the protagonist effortlessly dodges. Kane then leaps into the air for a powerful kick, but once again, the protagonist evades it with ease. After a brief exchange, both contestants pull back. Kane wears a smug grin, full of himself, while the protagonist notices how confident the bastard seems. Belinda, watching from the sidelines, is sweating nervously and even urges Elena to stop her brother. Meanwhile, the hooded figure feels assured that the protagonist is doomed. He believes Kane's immense strength will eventually overwhelm the protagonist, forcing him to exhaust all his energy on evasion until he leaves an opening. That, the hooded man claims, is how Kane has won countless battles. But the protagonist isn't so easily defeated. With his agility, he dodges every attack, forcing even Kane to admit that the protagonist is a slippery opponent whose skills have definitely improved. Gripping his massive sword by its sharp side with his bare hands, he uses it to swing at the protagonist with overwhelming force. Although the protagonist blocks the strike with his own sword, the sheer power traps his weapon in Kane's crossguard. Kane then lifts the protagonist into the air and swings him high above the ground. The spectators are left with jaws agape, while the hooded figure celebrates, convinced that the protagonist is finished. But the protagonist isn't done. He quickly channels mana into his legs, stabilizing himself midair. Then, to everyone's shock, he lands perfectly on the ground. At first, the protagonist was going easy on the bastard, but now that Kane has crossed the line, he's ready to teach him a hard lesson. With godly speed, the protagonist dashes at Kane and zips past him. The hooded figure is dumbfounded, realizing the protagonist used mana to safely land. The protagonist calls Kane an ignorant swordsman, mocking him for relying solely on brute strength. He believes Kane only thinks he's strong because weaker opponents get scared. But now, the protagonist is ready to show him that brute force is not everything. Enraged by the mockery, Kane charges at the protagonist again, demanding to know how he plans to prove that. The protagonist plants his feet firmly, kicks the sword's hilt into the air, leaps, and lands multiple strikes on Kane. The brute retaliates but misses as the protagonist sidesteps and steps onto Kane's sword itself, momentarily rendered weaponless. As the protagonist dramatically halts, Kane begins bleeding from the shallow wounds inflicted by the protagonist's blade. The spectators erupt in disbelief, awed by the protagonist's skill. Many panic, realizing the protagonist might actually win. Elena beams with pride, reminding Belinda there was no reason to worry. Commander Scoven is equally proud, but the hooded man starts sweating profusely. He realizes that the protagonist intentionally kept the wounds shallow, proving his superior skill. Kane, on the other hand, feels mocked. The protagonist throws his sword aside, declaring that the skill gap is too wide to warrant further weapon use. He will fight barehanded from now on. This humiliates Kane to the point of boiling rage. The protagonist, however, is ready to teach this brute a hard lesson, one he plans to deliver with his bare knuckles. The protagonist, brimming with confidence, believes this oversized, small-brained brute is no match for his skills in swordsmanship. He challenges Kane to a barehanded fight, a style where Kane undoubtedly excels. This time, my guy ups the stakes, betting 2,000 gold coins, double the amount he had initially demanded. The crowd murmurs uneasily at the mention of such a hefty wager, especially for a fistfight that was supposed to be a formal duel. Meanwhile, there's this hooded bastard in the background who can barely contain the sweat dripping down his face. The sheer audacity of our boy challenging Cain barehanded is enough to shake him. Yet deep in his gut, he senses there might be a slim chance Cain could actually win. The fat merchant starts shouting for the crowd to place their bets, officially announcing the fight as a barehanded duel between Lord Ghislain Peridum and Master Cain. At this point, the tide begins to shift. The crowd starts reconsidering their earlier bets. Cain accepts the challenge but refuses to let go of his sword. Belinda, panic written all over her face, shouts for the protagonist to pick up his weapon as well. But it's too late. Cain, with his massive sword, swings it down at our guy with all his might. Protagonist, cool as ice, waiting for the perfect moment. As the sword comes crashing down, he ducks with lightning speed, his silhouette almost lagging behind, and counters with a brutal punch to Cain's bloated leg. Before Cain can react, a crushing uppercut lands under his chin, leaving his face bloodied and his brain scrambled. One knee hits the ground. The protagonist straightens up, radiating confidence and undeniable charisma. With a cocky smile, he announces that he's just getting warmed up and invites Cain to keep coming. This bruises Cain's already fragile ego. Jaw clenched and pride stung, he barrels forward again. But the protagonist weaves effortlessly, dodging every attack. Left, right, back. No matter what Cain tries, he's met with counters so devastating the narrator himself struggles to keep up. Cain begins to realize just how far he's fallen. He recalls the days when the protagonist wouldn't even look him in the eye, bowing and keeping his distance whenever Cain appeared. But now, Cain is little more than a punching bag for this young master. The barrage of blows continues until Cain is a battered mess. His entire body is bruised, and his face so mangled that even his own mother wouldn't recognize him. The protagonist grabs Cain by the hair, looking down at him with something akin to pity. He thinks of Count Logos, Cain's father, who once supported House Peridum even when it was collapsing. Logos had stood by the protagonist's family without hesitation, simply because of his friendship with the protagonist's father. But Cain? Cain is nothing like his father. We cut to a memory from years ago. Cain is yelling at his father, furious that he keeps pouring resources into the declining Peridum estate. Logos, calm and resolute, tells his son that friendship isn't about logic or profit. He's doing this because it's the right thing to do. Cain can only watch in frustration as his father prepares to leave for Peridum once again. Back in the present, the protagonist clenches his fist, but this time, not for another punch. Instead, he extends a hand, a gesture of friendship. The crowd gasps. Cain, beaten and humiliated, stares at the outstretched hand before finally admitting defeat. The referee wastes no time declaring the protagonist as the winner, and the crowd erupts in cheers. House Peridum's supporters are ecstatic, while Elena, the protagonist's sister, beams with joy at her brother's unexpected triumph. But the hooded bastard isn't as thrilled. He storms over to Cain, berating him for surrendering so quickly. "How could you give up just because you were at a slight disadvantage?" he demands. Cain, beaten and drained, turns his head away and mutters, "I'm done playing your games." The hooded man's fury is short-lived, though, because the protagonist has plans of his own. With an innocent grin, he loudly announces that the hooded man has volunteered to pay for everyone's food and drinks. The crowd erupts with even greater enthusiasm at the promise of free meat. The hooded man is stunned, stammering protests and demanding the protagonist retract his words. But our boy calmly places a firm hand on the man's shoulder and tells him this is the price of losing. And just to clarify, the 2,000 gold from the bet still stands. If the hooded man tries to run, well, the consequences will be severe. The next day, we find the protagonist in his room, staring at a chest overflowing with gold coins. The sheer amount is staggering, enough to hire an entire mercenary corps. But he knows time is not on his side. His enemies won't wait for him to grow his forces, and he needs to execute his plans quickly. That's when Belinda and Elena stroll in, both wearing suspiciously satisfied smiles. The protagonist narrows his eyes, instantly questioning their motives. Elena, all sweetness and innocence, asks where he plans to spend all that money. He cuts straight to the point. "Do you want some?" She feigns innocence, claiming she's only curious. Belinda, ever perceptive, chimes in with her own theory. She teases that he must be planning something extravagant for Lady Amelia's upcoming birthday, perhaps a grand show or an expensive gift for his fiancée. The protagonist freezes at the word, completely caught off guard. Fiancée? This is news to him. He doesn't even seem to remember whether he has a fiancée. The maid chuckles softly, assuming he must just be feeling shy. Everyone figures he's only pretending to be clueless because he's embarrassed that they've caught on to him. Still, since Elena has noticed her brother has been more absent-minded than usual lately, she decides to jog his memory. She casually reminds him that they're talking about Amelia of Rold County. The name finally stirs some recollection in the protagonist's mind, but the memories that surface are far from pleasant. Amelia Rold is celebrated as a noble among nobles, widely admired for her compassionate nature and selfless deeds. Her people, regardless of rank or status, deeply respect her, and her land is full of loyal followers. But to the protagonist, honest, the truth is far uglier. To him, she isn't the cherished noblewoman that everyone praises, she's a traitor. Why? Because Amelia Roll, once a shining symbol of nobility, would one day be the catalyst of rebellion. She would earn the infamous title of the Witch of the North, aligning herself with the Deline Douay to deliver the final blow that would collapse Scovin. For the protagonist, she isn't some gentle fiancée but the very woman who betrayed everything his family once stood for. The protagonist then asks Belinda when his father will return, to which she responds uncertainly, likely in a week. That's all he needs to hear. With 7 days ahead of him, he decides to take a trip to Rold County. Belinda is puzzled by his sudden departure, especially since it's not yet Amelia's birthday, but he brushes it off, vaguely claiming he'll get money from them later. The scene shifts, and we are introduced to the infamous Amelia Roll. At first glance, her expression seems vacant and lifeless, yet you can't help but notice her striking features. She's in town, where she's seen kneeling before a poor little girl, offering her sandals. The child hesitates, unsure whether to accept something so precious, but Amelia assures her that if anyone on her land must walk barefoot, it should be her. She orders her soldiers to provide immediate food and shelter for the girl and her family. The troops move quickly to obey. As Amelia walks away with her soldiers, the gathered townsfolk call out their heartfelt thanks, echoing gratitude for their beloved lady. We next find ourselves in Amelia's private garden back in Rold County. There, a man is meticulously washing her feet with such reverence that it might make you envious. The man, Burf, is Amelia's loyal escort knight. He compliments her work, clearly proud of everything she's accomplished. Amelia, however, has a sharper perspective. She mentions that while her father ruled with absolute authority, the hearts of the common folk will always follow someone who keeps them fed and protected. Burf agrees, praising her strategy and pointing out that winning the people's trust will serve her well in the future competition for succession. However, Amelia doesn't seem particularly aligned with his ambitions. Showing her dominant side, she lifts her foot and presses it against his face, questioning him about the duel against the finest sword of the North. Burf apologizes, explaining that he deliberately lost the match to avoid unnecessary attention. Victory would have placed unwanted focus on her, and it's still too soon to reveal her hidden ambitions. Pleased with his loyalty, she allows him to kiss her feet passionately. Amelia sees this as her right. After all, she's invested heavily in ensuring that Burf becomes strong and dependable. She then brings up the merchants. Burf reassures her that everything is proceeding smoothly. The Aram Merchant Guild is buying up all the materials for the reconstruction of the Forest of Beasts outpost, which was recently devastated by orc attacks. This also allows them to siphon funds sent to Scovin while recruiting soldiers and knights abandoning that territory. These trained fighters, battle-hardened against barbarians, are now under her control. Amelia's plan to slowly drain resources and power from Scovin is working flawlessly. She reminds him to maintain the guild's appearance as a legitimate merchant business and warns him to be careful. Their true intentions cannot be revealed until her forces are fully prepared. Suddenly, her butler arrives, much to Burf's annoyance. The butler hastily delivers urgent news. Lord Ghislain Perdium has arrived at the castle gates. The mention of the protagonist's name wipes any hint of amusement from Amelia's face. She demands to know the reason for his visit. The nervous butler stammers before revealing that Ghislain is here to discuss the Merchant Guild. Both Amelia and Burf are momentarily stunned. The next scene opens in the visitor's room, where Amelia sits face to face with the protagonist. He greets her casually, but her expression is cold and contemptuous. She clearly disapproves of his unannounced visit, which she sees as yet another failure of etiquette. The protagonist shrugs it off, reminding her that since her birthday is coming up, he thought he'd deliver an early gift. He places a flower on the table, explaining that he picked it up from a merchant guild. He even comments on its pleasant fragrance, and says he plans to buy flowers from them going forward. He casually mentions the name Arkham Merchant Guild, clearly testing the waters. Amelia immediately realizes his implication, but she feigns ignorance, claiming she doesn't understand his point. Annoyed, she gets up to leave, but that's when the protagonist's tone shifts. He firmly calls her name and tells her to sit down. The sudden authority in his voice unsettles her, especially coming from a man she remembers as timid and uncertain. The protagonist cuts to the chase. He demands 10,000 gold coins. Amelia is naturally offended by his request. She sarcastically asks if his father sent him, but the protagonist denies this, adding that he already knows she has no intention of marrying him. He acknowledges her preparations to claim leadership of Rold County and subtly threatens her. If rumors about her hidden ambitions were to spread, it could jeopardize her chances in the succession battle. Amelia's glare sharpens. She warns him not to joke about such things. He assures her it's no joke and promises to keep her secret for now. However, if he walks away empty-handed, he makes no such guarantees. Amelia, though furious, remains composed. She calls for Burf, her ever-loyal knight, who promptly enters the room. The protagonist sizes him up, recalling that Burf has always been her shadow, a knight so skilled he could rival the finest sword of the North. Sensing where this is headed, the protagonist calmly reminds Amelia that killing him would provoke a war. But Amelia has already crafted her alibi. A ruffian entered the castle and caused a disturbance, only to be killed by her knight in defense of the house. With that, Amelia gives Berth the order to kill him. Berth doesn't hesitate, drawing his sword immediately. But the protagonist isn't backing down. If this is how she wants to play it, he has no choice but to show that he's more than capable of holding his own. The stage is set for yet another epic clash between two exceptional fighters, so get comfortable and prepare for what's about to unfold. However, this shameless knight has something else in mind. Just then, the protagonist hears faint rustling behind him. Before he can fully react, an assassin bursts out from an empty suit of armor, driving his sword straight into the sofa where the protagonist had been sitting, attempting to pierce through him in one strike. But the assassin's attack is far too sluggish. The protagonist swiftly rolls to the ground, delivers a brutal kick to the attacker, and hurls him straight through the window in a single fluid motion. Both Amelia and her devoted knight freeze in stunned disbelief. They never expected the protagonist to respond with such speed and precision. Brushing off the encounter, the protagonist voices his disdain for their cowardly tactics, pretending to be polite while launching a sneak attack. Without missing a beat, he charges straight at Berth, and their swords clash with explosive force. The protagonist glares at the knight mid-fight, his voice dripping with disgust as he questions whether Berth has abandoned all sense of chivalry. Berth calmly apologizes but reminds him that the protagonist's rude arrival and veiled threats were the true offenses here. Their blades collide again and again, both fighters testing each other, but it quickly becomes evident that the protagonist has the upper hand. His reflexes are razor sharp, and his swift movements allow him to keep pushing Berth back. Berth had clearly underestimated him, assuming the protagonist was all bluster with no skill to back it up. But now, the knight is learning the hard way that this man is no pushover. Meanwhile, Amelia's frustration grows with every passing moment. Watching her trusted knight struggle against someone she once dismissed as a weakling is infuriating. Her voice sharpens with anger as she orders Berth to stop playing around and end this fight. She wants the protagonist's head as proof of his loyalty. Motivated by his mistress's words, Berth straightens, his expression darkening with resolve. He boldly challenges the protagonist to come at him, ready to fight with everything he's got. The protagonist smirks at the audacity of the knight, mocking him for ordering someone of his stature. But if that's what Berth wants, the protagonist is more than willing to oblige. The two fighters launch back into a ferocious exchange of blows, but this time Berth isn't holding back. The intensity of the duel surges, and the knight manages to land a strike that leaves a shallow cut across the protagonist's face. Their movements are so blindingly fast that only flashes of their silhouettes remain, accompanied by the constant clang of steel. Amelia, growing increasingly anxious, watches in disbelief. The man she once thought of as a cowardly, incompetent fool is now holding his own against her finest knight. How is this even possible? The fight continues at breakneck speed, with neither gaining a clear advantage. The protagonist tries a familiar maneuver but is thrown hard to the ground by Berth's counter. Seeing an opening, Berth lunges forward to finish him off, but the protagonist recovers in time, flipping backward into a defensive stance. By now, the protagonist has pieced together Berth's strategy. The knight is using mana reinforcement to endure attacks and maintain his stamina. Berth, too, has realized that the protagonist isn't fighting with conventional swordsmanship. His movements are raw yet refined, the result of countless real battles. Berth smirks and taunts him, suggesting the protagonist picked up these chaotic techniques from fighting barbarians. While such methods might work on a battlefield, Berth claims they won't succeed here. The protagonist knows this fight isn't going to be easy. Berth's relentless, precise strikes constantly target his head, throwing off his sense of timing and distance. To make matters worse, Berth's superior size gives him an edge in close combat. Taking on this knight head-on was a risky move, like trying to defeat a final boss while still armed with basic gear. With lightning speed, the protagonist conjures a mana string that whips past Berth's ear before he even realizes what's happening. In one seamless motion, the protagonist grabs a hidden sword and strikes Berth hard at the back of his head. Following up immediately, he delivers a solid kick to Berth's face, momentarily stunning the knight. Amelia looks on, wide-eyed and stunned, unable to process what she's witnessing. The protagonist wastes no time and leaps into the air to deliver a finishing blow. However, Berth regains his senses just in time and hurls the protagonist away with a powerful shove, his strength bolstered by sheer determination. Panting and visibly shaken, Berth turns to Amelia, urging her to leave the room. He admits that he can no longer guarantee her safety and vows to fight at full power. He warns that the intensity of the battle could cause collateral damage if she stays any longer. The protagonist, meanwhile, is more energized than ever. It's been far too long since he's faced an opponent this formidable, and the thrill of the fight fuels him further. Meanwhile, Meanwhile, Amelia sprinted down the corridor with her cat, visibly shaken and furious. How dare that boy humiliate her like this? She had no idea who the fool was that leaked the Merchant Guild's information to Ghislaine Perdium. There was no possible way he could have known such precise details without outside help. The rumors surrounding him, slaying orcs, protecting his younger sister from assassins, and even defeating the heir of Lois, had always seemed far-fetched. She had written them off as luck or exaggeration. But now, she was forced to reconsider. Perhaps he really had improved. As Amelia ran, she suddenly realized that the guards were nowhere to be seen, which only frustrated her more. Moments later, she stumbled upon the soldiers sprawled across the ground, completely incapacitated. The culprit was none other than Belinda. Seeing that maid startled Amelia so much that she froze in place before she could react. Belinda wasted no time, pressing a dagger against Amelia's throat. At that moment, Belinda noticed a spider dangling near her face. Calmly, she caught the small creature in her hand, her disgust clear as she muttered about "filthy thing." In a sharp tone, she reminded Amelia that she remembered the engagement ceremony, the day Amelia had been caught eavesdropping on a conversation between Count Rold and the Lord of Scovin. Belinda recounted how Amelia's siblings mocked her relentlessly for the creepy spiders she kept around. But rather than break under their ridicule, Amelia had raised those spiders herself and turned them into her revenge. With a pointed tone, Belinda apologized if her words seemed harsh, but remarked that such behavior simply didn't suit her. With that, Belinda crushed the spider underfoot, leaving no room for argument. Then, she calmly requested that this spoiled lady cooperate with her. The scene shifted back to the intense fight between the boys. The night, now emanating a dark and ominous power, transformed the battlefield's atmosphere. The air grew heavy, and the overwhelming surge of mana left the protagonist wary. The knight was furious, openly chastising the protagonists for calling their duel entertaining. To him, such words were insulting, the sort of thing a lowly mercenary would say, as the protagonist dared to stand as an equal to Amelia. However, the protagonist, a noble in his own right, refused to accept this insult. In his view, a mere escort knight had no place to speak so arrogantly. Without another word, the knight advanced, and the two clashed violently. The knight fought with relentless rage, his blows raining down with immense power. The protagonist, though stunned by the ferocity, held his ground and met the knight's aggression with equal resolve. This time, the knight abandoned all restraint. A powerful swing sent the protagonist staggering back, followed quickly by another strike aimed for a decisive blow. Time seemed to slow as the blade landed, blood spraying as it grazed the protagonist's shoulder. The knight paused, visibly shocked that the protagonist had deliberately braced himself for the hit, using his shoulder to absorb the blade's force. Seizing the opportunity, the protagonist retaliated, pushing the knight backward. Yet the knight delivered a swift kick to his chest, sneering as he taunted. "This is the difference between a knight and a child who fights for sport." The kick sent the protagonist flying back, but it still wasn't enough to bring him down. He rose again, his eyes glinting with a mix of determination and amusement. The knight maintained control of the battle, using his overwhelming speed and range to dominate every exchange. Each attempt the protagonist made to counter was swiftly shut down. The knight sneered, convinced the protagonist couldn't match his raw strength, but the protagonist was patient. In a flash, the protagonist unleashed his third core, shifting the tide of battle instantly. With a single, explosive strike, he knocked the knight's sword from his hand, leaving him stunned and defenseless. The only thought racing through the knight's mind was disbelief. How could the protagonist generate such raw power? Before the knight could react, the protagonist placed his blade over the man's head, freezing him completely. At that precise moment, Belinda dragged Amelia into the scene. The once arrogant lady, now tearful and shaken, immediately agreed to hand over the 10,000 gold, pleading for them to just leave already. Though satisfied to have achieved his goal, the protagonist couldn't hide his irritation that the situation had escalated this far. With a flat expression, he remarked, "It would have been far simpler if you just agreed from the start." However, as he approached Amelia, his tone shifted ever so slightly. "Unfortunately for you, the fee has now gone up to 20,000 gold. In the aftermath, Amelia's entire palace lies in ruins. She storms around in frustration, throwing things in every direction. Not only did her knight lose, but now she has to hand over 20,000 gold. The knight tries to apologize, admitting that Ghislaine Perdium turned out to be far stronger than the rumors suggested. The protagonist had displayed mana exceeding even that of an advanced level knight. When Bernou suggests reporting the incident to Duke de Line, Amelia slaps him across the face. Grabbing his collar, she furiously rebukes him for suggesting something so impractical. It's clear she is terrified of Duke de Line. If he finds out about today's events, she's certain her fate is sealed. Her secret alliance with the Duke, made without her father's knowledge, is on the line. In exchange for his support in her rebellion, she promised to help bring down Perdium. If this covert deal is exposed, her siblings would surely kill her. If the protagonist has learned about the Arctia Merchant Guild's secret, secret. Amelia fears he might also uncover her agreement with the Duke. She knows he has to be stopped and resolves to do whatever it takes to crush him. The knight accepts her determination. Amelia then inquires about the protagonist's condition. The knight reports that while he managed to inflict minor injuries across his body, however, due to the explosive amount of mana the protagonist used, he will be in a weakened state for some time. Since they plan to eliminate him discreetly, they cannot use knights directly tied to their territory. Amelia had already anticipated this, which is why she trained a group of knights specifically for situations like this. Even Berna is unaware of these forces. She reminds him of the Wildcats, a group of war orphans, outcasts, and those without status. Only the most talented natural-born specialists are among them, known as the Wildcat trainees. She marks a location on the map and orders Bernu to assemble a dozen or so members, only those adept at mana control. The location Amelia chose makes strategic sense to Bernu. The ravine is the only narrow passage between Rolled Territory and Paradum, a perfect place to handle the matter quietly due to its remoteness and tight terrain. Bernu immediately sets off to execute the plan. This time, Amelia is absolutely determined to make the protagonist pay for humiliating her. Meanwhile, the protagonist has already departed from Amelia's palace. Inside his carriage, he carefully wraps his wounds with bandages. Accompanying him are old man Fergus and Belinda. They ask if he's alright, and he assures them the injuries aren't severe. Considering how hard he pushed himself, he says it could have been much worse. He's simply relieved that the 20,000 gold he secured from Amelia is enough to cover the foundational costs of rebuilding their territory, a sum that saves them years of effort. Killing Amelia would have been satisfying, but it would have made war inevitable, a risk he cannot afford. With Paradum already struggling against the barbarians, he knows it's wiser to avoid stirring more trouble. Knowing the secret of the Arctia Merchant Guild is already enough to weigh heavily on Amelia. Belinda observes him with concern and asks if everything is going as planned. She recalls that he instructed her to subdue the guards when she heard the sounds of fighting and to take Lady Amelia hostage if she appeared. The protagonist confirms that this was exactly what he told her. At that moment, he suddenly feels sharp pain and coughs up blood. It's the recoil from opening his third mana core. While his condition is better than before, it's clear that using this power takes a serious toll. He knows he must find a way to increase his mana capacity quickly. Belinda quickly notices that the flow of mana within his body is in complete disarray. Without hesitation, she grabs his hand and pierces a needle into its back with stunning precision. The protagonist finds the process surprisingly soothing. As Belinda finishes, he exhales deeply, feeling relief as his tangled mana pathways begin to open. What astonishes him is that the technique she used requires a profound understanding of mana manipulation. It makes sense, given that Belinda was brought into the palace by his mother, but it leaves him questioning her true origins. Why someone of her caliber works as a head maid in a countryside estate remains a mystery. Still, the protagonist knows the value of keeping skilled people close. The enemies he has faced so far are just the beginning. Belinda then assures him that she will help in any way she can because she trusts him unconditionally. However, she demands to know why he extorted such a massive sum from Lady Amelia. The protagonist casually states that he needed funds, and since Amelia is the richest person he knows, he decided to take advantage of her. His subordinates are stunned by this admission, finding it absurd that he ended his engagement with Amelia just for money. They warn him that Count Rold will not take this lightly. The protagonist simply smiles and asks Belinda if she really trusts him. Annoyed that he keeps asking the same question, Belinda reiterates her trust but insists he tell her what he plans to do with the money. The protagonist answers with a single phrase, "The Forest of Beasts." The words leave her momentarily speechless. He elaborates, revealing his intention to pioneer development in the Forest of Beasts. Fergus nearly jumps out of his seat, reminding the protagonist that attempts to develop that area have been ongoing since his great-grandfather's time, with no real progress. The protagonist reminds Fergus of the request he made earlier. Fergus hesitates but admits that the individual the protagonist wanted him to find is indeed at the location mentioned. However, Fergus isn't confident about visiting that person. Despite this, the protagonist has made up his mind to meet them at any cost. Belinda protests, arguing that he's in no condition to wander around. He counters by pointing out the reality of their situation. Amelia won't let them leave peacefully after everything that happened. Knowing her personality, she will attempt to eliminate him to safeguard her secret alliance with Duke Deline. Belinda flexes her scrawny arms, confidently proclaiming that she can take down anyone who dares cross their path. She reminds him they also have Fergus as backup. While the protagonist appreciates her resolve, he gently points out that this isn't her role. What they need is a vanguard, and they are on their way to meet him. Eventually, they arrive at a remote location where only a single shack stands. The carriage driver knocks, but no one answers. It feels as though the place is abandoned. Fergus, however, confirms that this is the address. Finally, the door creaks open, and a man with a face covered entirely in thick facial hair steps out, immediately questioning the identity of the visitors. The sight unsettles Belinda and Fergus, but the protagonist remains calm. Belinda, unconvinced, asks if this really is the person they're searching for, pointing out that the man doesn't look like someone capable of fighting, let alone surviving what's to come. The protagonist, unshaken, assures her that this is the man they're looking for. The old man glares at the protagonist and gruffly tells them to leave. That's when the protagonist addresses him by his true title, the ex-captain of the Ratatosk Mercenaries, Jillian. At the mention of his title, the man pauses. Slowly, he turns to face the protagonist, who extends his hand warmly, inviting him to join them. Both the old man and the carriage driver are stunned at the mention of the Ratatosk Mercenaries. The Ratatosk Mercenaries were a legendary band of warriors, known for their unmatched skill with weapons. Though the group has long ceased to exist, their reputation endures, and even distant lands echo with their name. At the helm of that legendary group stood Jillian, the very man the protagonist has journeyed all this way to find. The old man hurls his axe with all his might, but the protagonist effortlessly tilts his head, letting it sail harmlessly past. Instantly, everyone tenses. The men close ranks around their young master, weapons ready, bracing for what comes next. Jillian, however, has no interest in wasting time. He directly demands to know why the protagonist has sought him out. Belinda steps in front of the protagonist, convinced this man must be insane, but the protagonist keeps it simple. He says just 2 words: eternal punishment. He adds that he knows how to cure the incurable illness Jillian's daughter suffers from. That's enough to make Jillian pause. His daughter's condition brings on scorching fevers, relentless coughing of blood, and red spots blooming across her skin like cursed petals. The suffering is so agonizing that it resembles a prisoner enduring divine retribution, hence its cruel name, eternal punishment. We then see the girl herself. Her anguished screams pierce the air as Jillian rushes inside the shack to comfort his daughter, Rachel. The protagonist assesses her condition and determines it's not too late to save her. In his previous life, he had sought Jillian out to recruit him, only to find that the man had taken his life shortly after losing his daughter. Judging by the state of the house, it's clear Jillian has spent every last coin trying to save her. All that remains are his weapons. The girl cries out in agony, begging her father to end her suffering. Seeing her pain, the protagonist resolves to act without delay. He declares to Jillian that he'll begin treatment immediately. Belinda, however, grabs his arm, trying to stop him. She argues that this is no simple sickness. Even priests, with their divine abilities, have failed to heal it. This disease is no ordinary ailment. It's a punishment decreed by the gods themselves. What could the protagonist possibly do? The protagonist brushes off her hand with a firm response. He can fix this. Since she claims to trust him, he demands she keep her word. With no room left to argue, Belinda reluctantly relents. The protagonist hands her a list of herbs he'll need and sends her to gather them. Reading the ingredients, Belinda pauses, momentarily stunned. The protagonist's knowledge stems from a simple truth. For mercenaries, survival depends on knowledge. Though eternal punishment is currently considered incurable, a cure will be discovered in the future. Back then, the remedy caused quite a stir due to its simplicity, and the protagonist remembers it well. The only obstacle is the sky-high cost of the ingredients, especially the rare herb known as Fair's Blessing. Once the Fair's Blessing and other herbs are acquired, the protagonist meticulously prepares the cure. He chops the ingredients, packs them into a bottle, and pours distilled alcohol over the mixture, shaking it thoroughly. After allowing it to sit for a time, he adds the final components and carefully stirs them together. With that, the remedy is complete. He presents the potion to Jillian and instructs him to give it to Rachel. With no other options, Jillian complies, pouring the medicine into his daughter's mouth. The effects are immediate. The bruises and red patches on her body begin to fade, leaving everyone speechless. Jillian stares in disbelief, overwhelmed by what he's witnessing. Trembling, Jillian asks how the protagonist knew about this cure when even divine magic failed. The protagonist explains that divine power isn't absolute. It enhances the body's vitality and strengthens its ability to resist illness, but it doesn't provide a direct cure. Jillian's hands shake as he reaches for the protagonist, desperate for reassurance. Will his daughter truly recover? The protagonist assures him that, though it will take a few months, Rachel will make a full recovery. The mercenary captain's eyes widen in astonishment. Overcome with emotion, the once mighty man collapses to his knees, bowing his head low. He humbly asks what the protagonist wants in return. The old warrior insists that he has nothing to give except his own life. If the protagonist needs him to serve like a dog, so be it, he will follow every command. But the protagonist rejects the offer of servitude. What he needs is Jillian, the legendary leader of the Ratatosk mercenaries. When Jillian looks up, he sees something familiar in the protagonist's gaze, the unyielding eyes of a dreamer. Jillian rises, picks up his axe, and slices off his ponytail, a symbolic gesture that transforms him. Now, he looms like a titan, radiating raw power and confidence. He asks if anyone else has come here besides the protagonist's group. The protagonist confirms it's just them. Jillian then inquires if there are enemies who hold grudges against him. The protagonist calmly responds that there are, and there will be more in the future. With a grim smile, Jillian takes his harpoon and imbues it with mana. He launches it with incredible speed, the weapon tearing through his hut and into the distant forest. Moments later, he reels the rope back, dragging a man impaled on its barbs. Jillian hoists the intruder effortlessly, his grip unrelenting, and demands to know who sent him. The spy, still reeling, seems more impressed by Jillian's instincts than afraid. Jillian turns to the protagonist and asks what should be done with the man. The protagonist, unbothered, says he already knows who sent the spy but doesn't want to dirty his blade on such a day. However, he admits there's little choice. Before he can act, Jillian steps in, stopping him. With brutal efficiency, Jillian tightens his grip, and the spy's screams echo into the night. When the deed is done, Jillian kneels before the protagonist, vowing his life to him. Meanwhile, Belinda looks on, visibly disturbed. Seeing Jillian kill so easily and so coldly shakes her. She can't comprehend why the protagonist would recruit such a dangerous man. Jillian, however, bows his head, a man reborn. From this moment on, his life belongs to the protagonist. The protagonist responds with a calm, confident smile, eager to see what they will accomplish together. The scene transitions to a lone hut standing in the heart of a swamp. Inside, the wildcat traffickers are thrown into chaos as a report confirms the death of their reconnaissance unit. The air is heavy with tension until a senior member speaks up, demanding everyone calm down. This man is Virgo, the captain of the squad. Virgo, his voice steady but sharp, remarks that according to intel from BF, Ghislain Perdium shouldn't have even been able to locate the reconnaissance team, let alone eliminate them. He questions aloud whether the unit was incompetent or if their information was flawed. That's when the reporter stammers nervously, revealing even more startling news. Jillian has joined Ghislain Perdium's group. Virgo's expression twists with fury. Seizing the reporter by the throat, he growls for confirmation. Barely able to breathe, the man chokes out his answer again. He saw it with his own eyes. The anger in Virgo's face shifts to an unsettling fascination. He never imagined that big guy would return to the battlefield. Moreover, Virgo reveals he was once part of the Ratatosk mercenaries, the group Jillian led before its disbandment. The focus shifts back to the protagonist's party. This time, Jillian is driving the carriage, reins in hand. Inside, Belinda looks like she's suffocating under the sheer volume of weaponry packed into the space. Swords, axes, and spears are stacked haphazardly, leaving her barely any room. Frustrated, Belinda mutters about Jillian's absurd arsenal, questioning whether he really needed to bring so much. Couldn't he have managed with a sword or two? With this much gear, she jokes, he could pass for an arms dealer. Meanwhile, the protagonist tries to reassure Belinda. He reminds her that Jillian will undoubtedly put these weapons to good use. For now, she'll have to endure it. Escaping the rift safely is the priority. Belinda shifts the conversation to the spy they captured earlier. She explains that the man must have been sent by Amelia. What's troubling, however, is the mask he wore, the mark of the wildcat traffickers. The wildcat traffickers, Belinda explains, are a powerful guild and role. They deal in smuggling, assassination, drugs, and human trafficking, filthy work that no one else dares to take. Worse, many of their members are former mercenaries, highly skilled in combat, giving the guild an unsettling amount of influence in the shadows. The protagonist is surprised. How does she know so much about them? After all, she's rarely left the castle. Belinda shrugs it off, saying she heard plenty before she began working there. In any case, she warns the protagonist to stay on guard. The enemy is tenacious. Noting her concern, the protagonist smiles faintly, reassuring her that everything will be fine. After all, Jillian is with them now. Without warning, the ground beneath them starts to shift. From the sand, two assassins emerge, quickly closing in on the carriages from either side. With deadly precision, they spring forward, aiming directly for Jillian. But Jillian doesn't flinch. In one fluid motion, he grabs a sword with one hand and an axe with the other, effortlessly blocking both assassins' strikes. Before they can react, he twists his weapons, tearing their arms clean off. He cuts them down as though they were nothing. More assassins appear, triggering traps as they move. Giant logs begin to plummet toward the carriages. But Jillian pulls the reins so sharply that the horses screech to a halt just in time, the logs crashing harmlessly to the ground in front of them. The scene quickly escalates as more assassins swarm the the area. Their weapons, embedded grotesquely into their hands, glint menacingly in the light. Watching from a distance, Virgo sneers. He calls Jillian by his old title, former captain of the Ratatosk Mercenaries. He mocks Jillian, accusing him of cowardice for disbanding the group just because of his daughter. Jillian doesn't respond, his silence sharper than any retort. Virgo continues bitterly. After the mercenaries disbanded, Virgo claims, his life spiraled into something he never wanted. He snarls at Jillian to stop acting like he doesn't remember, but it's clear Jillian doesn't recognize him. Still, Virgo insists he's only pretending. Virgo finally signals his lackeys to attack. The protagonist starts to offer help, but Jillian stops him with a calm wave of his hand. "They're here for me," he says simply. "I'll deal with them." The assassins charge, but Jillian is a force of nature. He swings his weapons with terrifying speed, cutting through the first wave as though they were paper. The second group rushes in, but they meet the same fate. One assassin manages to get close, but Jillian tears him apart as if it were nothing. Virgo watches from the sidelines, unimpressed. This is exactly what he expected from the former captain of the Ratatosk Mercenaries. Realizing direct attacks won't work, Virgo orders his men to split up and attack from both flanks. Jillian doesn't wait. Axe in hand, he mounts his horse and charges straight at them. With one swing, he obliterates everyone in his path. Desperate, the assassins turn their focus to the horse, hoping to stop his momentum, but it's useless. Jillian's axe tears through them like a blender. Finally, Virgo himself enters the fight. He charges at Jillian, sword drawn, but his attack is blocked effortlessly by Jillian's axe. Jillian regards him coldly. "I'm no longer the captain of the Ratatosk Mercenaries," he says. With one crushing blow, Jillian sends Virgo sprawling to the ground. Blood drips from Virgo's mouth as he struggles to his feet, demanding to know who Jillian is now, if not the captain. Jillian begins to channel his mana, his presence overwhelming. "I've discarded my past," he says calmly. "I am now nothing but young Lord Ghislain Perdium's subordinate." Virgo's face contorts in disbelief. His rage boils over, and he charges like a madman. The clash begins, both warriors throwing everything they have into the fight. Yet it soon becomes apparent that the one faltering is Virgo, his attacks fueled by pure frustration. He reminds Jillian that the mercenary company fell apart after Jillian's departure. Because of that choice, Virgo lost his power and was reduced to a life of disgrace, barely scraping by to survive. Jillian does not respond to Virgo's accusation. Instead, he presses forward, unleashing relentless strikes. At last, Virgo lands a heavy kick, shattering Jillian's shield. Seething, Virgo declares that he had been willing to sacrifice everything to make the Ratatosk Mercenaries the greatest force in history, only for Jillian to abandon it all and become a pawn of some spoiled noble. That betrayal is something he can never forgive. Virgo hurls his deadly ninja daggers, but Jillian deflects 3 of them with a swing of his axe. Virgo charges in, dagger drawn, yet Jillian sidesteps the strike with ease. Virgo is convinced that Jillian is nothing compared to the warrior he once was. While Jillian wasted years trying to save his daughter, Virgo honed his skills through countless battles. To him, this can no longer hold a candle to his strength. Virgo retrieves the daggers and launches them again, but Jillian, unfazed, catches them with his bare hand, as if they were mere pebbles. Virgo lunges once more, narrowly evading Jillian's axe, which carves through the air with deadly precision. Just as Virgo's dagger aims for its target, Jillian channels mana into his hand, stopping the blade mid-flight. At last, Jillian speaks. He asks if revenge is truly the only thing driving Virgo. Taken aback, Virgo realizes that Jillian has been holding back his true strength. Before he can react, Jillian's axe slams into his face, sending him hurtling into a tree with crushing force. Jillian approaches, calm yet firm. He questions why Virgo didn't confront him sooner if revenge was his sole motivation. Virgo sneers, revealing that he already visited Jillian's old home, only to find nothing but a weak old man unworthy of killing. The realization that the captain he once revered no longer existed was a bitter pill to swallow. Recognizing Virgo's warrior spirit, Jillian tosses him a sword and draws his own second blade. He tells Virgo that, though bound by another's will now, he will honor his former comrade with the respect he deserves, as the captain of the Ratatosk Mercenaries. For Virgo, this is a dream come true. He seizes the weapon and charges, their battle igniting once more. Sparks fly as their blades clash in a furious exchange. At first, they appear evenly matched, but then Jillian finds an opening. His blade drives deep into Virgo's ribs. Even with the grievous wound, Virgo fights on, refusing to give up. He strikes back, but his attack is futile. Jillian raises his weapon, ready to sever Virgo's head. In that moment, Jillian speaks softly. He assures Virgo that he will always remember him as the 5th unit commander of the Ratatosk Mercenaries, Virgo Villanos. A faint smile crosses Virgo's face as he takes pride in being acknowledged by the man he once admired. It is his final moment before Jillian's blade ends his life. With the battle over, Jillian picks up Virgo's dagger. Protagonist steps out of the carriage alongside Belinda, and their eyes take in the carnage, limbs and corpses scattered across the ground. Belinda, ever practical, remarks that they could make a small fortune by looting the bodies. Jillian lowers his head apologetically for the delays, but protagonist assures him it was nothing to worry about. Instead, he marvels at Jillian's extraordinary skill, far surpassing his expectations. In his previous life, protagonist had heard tales of Jillian's prowess when he first started his mercenary career. Those stories had been instrumental in shaping his path toward becoming the mercenary king. Now, he feels fortunate to have gained such a reliable ally. Seeing Jillian lingering over Virgo's dagger, protagonist asks if he knew the man. Jillian confirms that Virgo was an old comrade, once a brother-in-arms. The mention of old comrades stirs something in protagonist. He begins to reflect on his own friends from his past life. Where might they be now? He hadn't encountered them yet in this life, but he believes they are out there somewhere, forging their own paths. Protagonist silently resolves to find them and recruit them into his party once again. With everything settled, protagonist agrees to Belinda's suggestion to gather whatever valuables the wildcat traffickers left behind. Belinda playfully orders Jillian to take the lead in looting, only for the gruff warrior to remind her that he is not her servant. 2 days later, the group finally arrives at Scoven territory. After days of travel, they reach their destination. Jillian asks if this is truly Scoven, and protagonist confirms it with a nod. As protagonist peers through the carriage window at his territory, he feels an unexpected warmth. When he first left home, he thought he could always come back, but he had been wrong. Turning to Jillian, protagonist asks for his opinion on the place. Caught off guard, Jillian hesitates before muttering, "It's great," but protagonist can see the truth. The place is in ruins. The houses are crumbling, the fields are barren, and renovation seems impossible. With the farmers conscripted into the military, the land has been left to rot. Jillian shares what he's heard, rumors of Scoven's constant wars against the northern barbarians. But now, seeing it firsthand, he admits the situation is far graver than he imagined. Protagonist assures him that this is exactly why he needs Jillian's strength. It will be a long battle to erase the influence of Duke Deline and reclaim what was lost. Protagonist is determined to revive this land, no matter the cost. As their carriage rolls into the castle grounds, Belinda suddenly freezes, her eyes wide with shock. Standing before them is a figure protagonist immediately recognizes, his father. If you're excited for the next part, leave a comment, and I'll do my best to bring it to you as soon as possible.